All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Apu, and I'll be facilitating this webinar today. I just wanted to say it's an honor to facilitate this webinar called Seen and Believed, Domestic Violence in LGBTQIA plus communities. And before I start, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am presenting today, which is the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and who are the custodians of the land for thousands of years. The Noongar people have a deep and enduring connection to the land, waterways, and culture of this region, and we recognise and honour their continuing spiritual and cultural practices. I also want to just recognise that they acknowledge that I acknowledge the Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land and pay respects to their elders past, present, as well as the leaders emerging. Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So a bit of housekeeping before we start, just double checking if everyone has their microphones on mute, just so that we can hear the presenters while they're speaking. I also just want to make sure that if you have any questions for the presenter today, I highly encourage you to put that on the chat in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll take questions at the end of the presentation. Also, if you have more than one person joining in today to today's webinar with you, just pop that in the chat box as well. It just helps us with letting us know how many people are joining in today. And if you have any technical issues throughout any time of the webinar, just let us know by putting it in the chat box, and we'll do our best to help you. And also the webinar is recorded today. So just a bit about ourselves and who we are at Injury Matters. We are for safer people and places, and we aim to prevent and reduce the impact of injury within the WA community. And we do this through advocating and providing education for injury prevention, as well as providing support for people who have been impacted by an injury. And today's webinar is through the No Injury program, which is one of the 3 programs that we offer at Injury Matters. It's in support of with support of the WA Department of Health. No Injury is a statewide program which aims to enhance the capacity of injury prevention and safety promotion practitioners to deliver quality injury prevention activities. And we provide trainings, resources, and networking opportunities, such as the webinar today as well. So the right to live a life free from violence and abuse is a person's most basic human right. But for many LGBTQIA plus people, this is not a reality. 1 in 2 LGBTQ people will experience domestic, family, and intimate partner violence and abuse in their lifetime. Yet victims remain largely invisible, with incredibly low levels of reporting. LGBTQ Domestic Violence Awareness Day is a day that is held annually on May 28th to highlight domestic, family, and intimate partner violence and abuse occurring in LGBTQ plus communities. And it's the point of the Awareness Day is to raise awareness and about how we as health professionals can help address barriers and provide support to victims when needed. So to explore more about this topic, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Ben Bjarnesen, who is a passionate educator, campaigner, and speaker who believes that all people, no matter what their sexual identity or gender identity, deserves the right to live a life free from domestic violence and abuse. Ben became a fierce advocate for improved services for LGBTQ victims and survivors of DV after discovering an incredible gap in services after himself experiencing abuse within the same-sex relationship. So I'd like to hand over to Ben.
Thank you very much. I'll just get my PowerPoint up. So I'm a big 6'3" police officer. Most people wouldn't really look at me and think that I could be a victim of domestic violence. I didn't think I could be either, but here I am as proof that domestic violence can happen to anyone. I felt ashamed, I felt invisible, and I felt stupid that I ended up in this position, but I now know that domestic violence can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter what your job is, how much money you earn, your sexuality, your gender identity, your religion, or your cultural background. Domestic violence is here and it's harming our very own LGBTQ friends, family members, and work colleagues every day. As many as 1 in 2 LGBTQ people will be in a violent or abusive relationship at some time in their life. 1 in 2. Yet despite these incredibly alarming figures, there's still a massive lack of awareness about this issue. For me, I felt helpless. I had no idea what to do or where to go for support, and really just fumbled through on my own. Domestic violence in LGBTQ relationships is commonly not identified or seen as abuse, and there's an enormous gap in support services available. LGBTQ people are what we call the invisible victims of domestic violence, who are too often overlooked when it comes to prevention initiatives, support services, or awareness campaigns. This means they may not even realise domestic and family violence can affect them and their relationships. As a result, they don't get the support that they need and remain at a greater risk of abuse and harm. I know I was afraid to talk to anyone about it. I thought people would judge me, and I wasn't sure if I'd be believed or if I'd be taken seriously. On the surface and on social media, my relationship looked great. My partner and I lived in a beautiful house. We had a gorgeous German Shepherd called Zulu. We went away on holidays together and nights out on the town, but beneath the surface, it was a relationship that was based on power and control. I was forever worrying about when his next outburst of anger would be and what that next outburst was going to bring. Sort of worried, was he going to embarrass me in front of my friends or family? Was he going to abuse me? Would he damage property? Would he assault me? Or was the next time going to be something worse? The abuse started quite early in the relationship, where he would get jealous if I spoke to anyone that he didn't know. Something as simple as saying hello to a childhood friend at an event could spark a fit of rage that could end with him pushing me or throwing things at me. He would blame his behavior on being drunk, on mental health issues, or being scared of losing me. And he'd say things like, I just love you so much that it makes me crazy. Rather than seeing these behaviors as red flags, I thought to myself, wow, this guy must really love me if he's this scared of losing me. There was always a build-up of tension where I'd find myself walking on eggshells and avoiding anything that I thought could set him off. After a while, I knew what might set him off and when the next outburst was coming. At times, it could be because I went out with family or friends for dinner without him. At times, it could be getting home from work late. Something as simple as holding his hand, or even what I cooked for dinner. As a precaution for the impending outbursts of anger, at times I would prepare the house to help ensure my safety. I'd find myself hiding the knife block in the kitchen. I would put the garage door up. I'd have the car keys in the ignition and have the front door open, ready for a quick escape if I needed it. What I was experiencing made me feel terrible, but I always had this nagging doubt about whether it was abuse. I sort of questioned myself, could I be a victim of abuse, or was I just being too sensitive? Or is this what it's like to be in a same-sex relationship? Or was it because he had a tough childhood? I was confused because as a gay man, I didn't really associate myself with someone who could be a victim of domestic violence. There was one time I recall I just wanted him to punch me in the face. So I had a clear indicator that it was domestic violence and a specific reason to leave him. Despite this, I still wasn't recognizing what I was experiencing as domestic violence. Every time I used violence or abuse, next came the apologies, the promises to change, and these grand gestures to prove how much he loved me. They range from promises to drink less, to see a psychologist, to commitment rings, promises to marry, and even a tattoo of my name on his chest. I saw it all. What I didn't see was a way out. My view of domestic violence was it was something that was committed by a man against a woman. I was a big, tough police officer and felt so ashamed. How could I be a victim? I was well educated, had a good job, and I'm male. And sort of wondered, what would people say and Would people believe me, or would I just be seen as weak and told to man up? What I now know is that while domestic violence in LGBTQ relationships and heterosexual relationships share many similarities, there are also several unique methods of using power and control. They can include threats to out or reveal their partner's sexuality, gender identity, or health status to family, friend, or work colleagues. Pressure to conform to certain gender or sexuality stereotypes. Ridiculing the other person's expression of their sexuality or gender identity, or isolation from LGBTQ friends, venues, and events. When I searched for support services, I only found services for men using violence against women, and that really reinforced that belief that I couldn't be a victim. It wasn't until I stumbled on a LGBTQ domestic violence website and found a relationship checklist and ticked nearly every box that I finally realised what I was experiencing was domestic violence. When we look at support services advertising, government campaigns, and news articles, they most often speak about domestic violence victims being women and children. I found this was an international trend when I travelled the globe as part of a Churchill Fellowship. Over 6 weeks, I visited 6 countries, 8 police departments, and 16 support services, investigating methods for police to enhance the way that they respond to domestic violence in LGBTQ communities. Studies have shown that LGBTQ people are far less likely to reach out to police or support services. Alarmingly, one study indicated that only 1 in 20 people who had experienced domestic violence had actually reported the abuse to police. These low reporting figures to police can be attributed not only to the lack of awareness of domestic violence in LGBTQ communities, but also due to the historically negative and challenging relationships between police and LGBTQ communities. It was only in 1991 that here in Queensland, the government decriminalised homosexuality. It was only in 1992 that the World Health Organization removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. These historical incidents of police targeting LGBTQ people based on those laws of the day can still lead a lot of LGBTQ people to distrust police and fear that they won't be treated appropriately. So victims of DV and LGBTQ relationships also face challenges when accessing support services, as the domestic and family violence sector is generally funded and operates under a gendered framework which doesn't meet the needs of LGBTQ people. Crisis accommodation, perpetrator behavioural change programs, and court safe rooms are all designed to protect heterosexual women. As a result, LGBTQ people just simply don't receive the support that they need. In most states, housing is only available for women, which means male victims, no matter what their sexuality, may have no other option than to access homeless services. So while support services continue to provide assistance to people based on their sexuality and gender identity, LGBTQ people are going to remain at a greater risk of failing to engage with support services and police. This will leave them at a high risk of abuse and harm without that early identification and intervention. We cannot rely solely on government departments, support services, and police to solve this problem. We all have a responsibility as individuals if we're going to end domestic and family violence in our communities. It's quite common for incidents of abuse to be witnessed by others, with up to 1 in 3 incidents being witnessed by a bystander. But despite this, most people aren't aware of what constitutes domestic violence or what they can do to help. There are many resources available that you can utilise, such as bystander toolkits and relationship checklists, or the Be There app, which I'll talk about a bit later. These resources can help give you the confidence that you need to assist someone in an abusive relationship. By showing your support, you could change their life in ways you can't even imagine, and you could even save one. We need to challenge our beliefs and the way that we talk about domestic violence and work together as a community if we're going to end domestic violence in our communities and ensure that there are no invisible victims in the future. Everyone, no matter what their sexuality or gender identity, should feel seen and believed and be valued and be given hope. And this will assist them in reaching out for support when they need it. So, as I've been saying, traditionally when people think of domestic violence, they think of it as an issue that affects women and children, with males perpetrating violence. So if you were to Google the term domestic violence, you would be presented with services for men using violence and services for women experiencing violence, and images like this. As a result, LGBTQ people simply aren't going to see themselves as being able to experience violence or being a perpetrator if they can't identify with those portrayed characteristics of domestic violence within the public eye. So I'll run you through a thing called the streak test, which is a bit tricky online, but we'll give it a go anyway. But in your house or your office, hopefully if you don't have people around you, it will be a bit less weird. But I want you to sort of have a look at this. So it's basically, it gives you an idea of how hard it is to modify ingrained associations between two concepts or our implicit biases. So with me, as quickly as you can, I want you to say the words or the font colors going from the top to bottom as quickly as you can. So red, green, yellow, brown, pink, blue, purple, yellow, purple, pink, blue, red, green, brown. So as you can see with that one, it demonstrates the ease that we can do tasks that are in agreement with our associations. So this time I want you to say the font colors out loud that you see, not the words. Don't be scared, because it is honestly, it's a really good way of demonstrating how hard it is to do things that differ from our associations. So with as quickly as you can with me, the font color. So purple, blue, pink, yellow, brown, green, red. And I'll leave it there because I'm pretty sure you'll all be struggling just as much as I am, but it just goes to show how hard it is to do things that require us to do dissonant tasks, and our brains really fight us each step of the way. So in a domestic violence setting, the most common association with the term is domestic violence. Sorry, most common association of the term domestic violence is physical violence, which is perpetrated by a male against a female. And this association can contribute to that belief that DV is a heterosexual problem, which rarely affects LGBTQ communities. So some of the most recent research out is from the Private Lives survey in 2020 out of La Trobe Uni in Victoria. Alarmingly, that found that 60.7% of LGBTQ plus people had experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime, and 64.9% had reported that they experienced family violence in their lifetime. It's been found that the true nature and extent of DV suffered by LGBTQ people remains largely hidden, as there's very little data and research around the prevalence. There's sort of this and one other study in 2020, and prior to that, we were looking at studies from sort of 2012 with quite small sample sizes. While focus on this issue is growing, there's a general acknowledgement, though, that it's underreported, under-researched, and under-responded. So when we look at domestic violence reporting, the people that did experience violence, 72% of those people did not talk to a person about it, did not report to anyone. Of the ones who did, 18.7% went to a counsellor or psychologist, and 4.4% to a doctor or hospital. So a really quite a large concentration in that health setting. Anecdotally, a lot of the information that we receive at the moment is a lot of the time people presenting in those situations are actually presenting for a mental health crisis, or they're presenting to their doctor or their psychologist with the belief that they have depression or similar, only to find out that that's not the case, and that's actually they're feeling the way they are because they're experiencing domestic and family violence. Then next down the line, we've got 5.9% police. The interesting thing between the health and police is people are also asked their experiences, so the satisfaction rate, I suppose. So the satisfaction rate was upwards of 60-70% in the health setting, and then police, it was down around 40%. Then we look at phone helplines. Can really be attributed, I think, a lot of the time to that belief that there's no support there for LGBTQ people. Same with the DFV services. Employers, we'll talk about shortly, and then LGBTQ services, 1%, which is often believed as, due to the availability of those services around the country. So I guess one thing to note, it's not until community are confident in reporting to police and support services that they will actually report or seek assistance. So therefore, the more confidence LGBTQ communities have in services and police, the more reporting there will be of incidents, and we'll actually see those reporting rates go up. So another study found some of the unique experiences, especially for gay, bi, trans, intersex and queer men 18 to 24, they're more likely to accept a partner putting their hand around a throat, them reading their emails or text messages without permission, telling them who they can and can't be friends with. And violence and sexual assault is often seen as less serious when alcohol, drugs or hormone therapy were present. So I'll just go through some of the myths that you may have heard around, and then we'll go through sort of what a healthy and unhealthy relationship might look like. But these sort of myths can lead to LGBTQ people themselves or support services not necessarily realizing that DV can affect communities in the way that it does. So often one that we hear is DV is mainly a straight issue and doesn't occur often in LGBTQ relationships. So I'm aware, obviously, in WA that you do call it family violence over there. It changes state to state. So you'll either hear me talking about domestic violence, family violence, or DFV as it's written here, which is domestic and family violence, which is what we use in Queensland here. Another myth is a man should be able to defend himself. Incidents of DFV are less severe in LGBTQ relationships. The more masculine, bigger or stronger partner is typically the abuser. That is pretty relevant, not so much in Australia, but overseas where there are mandatory arrest laws, where we see a lot of LGBTQ people who are victims of violence actually being arrested themselves based on their size, rather than investigations of who's in need of protection. It's easier for LGBTQ victims to leave abusive relationships. Violence in LGBTQ relationships is a mutual fight, or same-sex couples are equal and therefore can't be victims. So there are a lot of the myths that we see that perpetuate violence in our communities. So as I said earlier, it wasn't until I completed a relationship checklist online that I really came to terms with the fact that I was in an abusive relationship. It's a valuable tool which I can encourage you and your friends and your family to use, and it can assist in identifying unhealthy traits in relationships. So in an unhealthy relationship, when you look at this list, you can use it to check your own relationship. You can take into consideration your friends or your family. So your partner treats you like a possession or becomes jealous for no reason. And I guess as a bit of background, I'll give you a few examples from my relationship. So jealousy, it's often the first sign that a lot of people see. For me, I was out in our nightclub precinct here, I suppose. We're going home and we're at McDonald's, and there was a guy in front of me that was speaking Danish, and my family being Danish, I said hello to him. That was literally about it. Got home, and then my partner, enraged, started screaming at me, accusing me of wanting to cheat, and started pushing me and throwing things at me. And the next day, apologized and just said he was scared of losing me. The next one, isolation from friends and family. So saying things like, your friends don't like me, your family don't like me, they'll never love you as much as I do, I'm all you need, let's just spend the night together. Monitoring of whereabouts, so constant phone calls or texts, checking where they are, who they're with, when they'll be home, or monitoring by things like Find My iPhone or installing tracking devices on cars and phones. Tells a person how to present, so whether they're too feminine, too masculine, I don't like your clothes, or telling them what to wear. Constant criticism or belittlement. So I was always told, you've got bad skin, you're too pale, do you really need to eat that? You're dumb, do you want to lose weight? You shouldn't be eating as much as me, or you should go to the gym. So things like that. So walking on eggshells, avoiding any topic that you think might cause them to go off, that might start an argument. Monitoring of finances, so controlling your money, giving you an allowance. Monitoring of phone and social media. So saying things like, if you've got nothing to hide, then why don't you show me? Or why don't you give me your password? Or if you don't, you must be hiding something if you don't give me a password. Or telling you who you can and can't be friends with on social media. or asking you to delete LGBTQ people from your socials. So threats of outing as a method of control. Well, first have people deported or lose their current visa status. So in a healthy relationship, you should feel safe, supported, appreciated, and valued. You can be your true self. Know your partner has your best interests at heart. Feel free to share your opinions, feel respected, like you're equals in the relationship, and you feel to make your own decisions. So when we look at abusive relationships, it's important to recognize that they aren't always abusive and that there is always a cycle of abuse. For some people, it might be a week to go through this cycle. For others, it might be 6 months. And as we talk about these sections, I'll give you some examples again from my own relationship, which looking back, I wasn't identifying as abuse. So first up the top right, we've got the pursuit phase. They make you feel special. They buy you presents. They make love, have sex. In my relationship, there was things like commitment rings, the promises to marry, the tattoo of the name of my name on his chest, just to name a few. Next, we've got the pleasant phase. So the relationship continues as normal and there aren't really any issues. The tension phase, you feel like you're walking on eggshells. You start to change your behavior to prevent an explosion. For me, it was avoiding things like going out with friends, texting updates about where I was, who I was with, or not going to a party when he asked me not to, just to avoid a fight, or changing what I was wearing to make him happy. Then the abusive phase. So it could be physical, emotional, sexual, intimidation, or all of the above. For me, I experienced all of these, but it was always followed by the remorse phase in the coming hours or days. So the remorse phase, the abuser might minimize or justify it by blaming you or other stressors. They might feel guilty and say sorry that it will never happen again. Things like, I love you so much, it makes me crazy, or I can't imagine my life without you, or saying things like, I'm stressed at work, or, you're too sensitive, or it's because I had an abusive childhood, or promises to, I'll see a psychologist, I'll start taking medication again, I'll drink less, I'll stop taking drugs, or normalizing the abuses, just saying, everyone fights, or, this is what LGBTQ relationships are like. And then we go back to the pursuit phase. Things are great. They're seeing a psychologist. They're not drinking. They're being super sweet. They're changing the behavior, and you're starting to see the good side of them again. You've got hope for the relationship and you're feeling good about yourself. Then we go to the pleasant phase, where it continues relatively normally, and then around that cycle goes again. So some of the barriers to accessing support. So fear of isolation, homophobia, or transphobia in the wider community can contribute to the victims staying with an abusive partner. Victims may not recognise that certain experiences or behaviours actually constitute domestic violence. So, like I was saying, a lot of LGBTQ people might not be aware of what defines a DV relationship. There's often that belief that it must be physical violence. And there's also, like I've been saying, that lack of recognition of abuse in LGBTQ relationships. So they might just not simply recognise what they're experiencing is domestic violence. An abusive partner might use homophobia or transphobia to control or isolate the victim. So by suggesting, they won't be believed or they shouldn't report the violence because they'll be discriminated against by police or support services. Those negative historical events involving police in LGBTQ communities. Poor recognition of DV within LGBTQ plus relationships by support services, police, workplaces, and the general community. So a lot of mainstream services might not be aware of what strategies can be used by abusers, such as those using the threats of outing as a form of control. And also a lot of victims are aware that there are no specific support services generally for LGBTQ victims, and therefore they don't report the abuse, knowing that they might not properly be supported. And there's a fear of their sexuality or gender identity being exposed to their family, friends, or workplaces if they were to report the violence or abuse. So some more, they believe they won't be believed or taken seriously. And, those myths that I was talking about earlier, the belief that men can protect themselves or women aren't violent. Not wanting to come out about their gender identity or sexuality. A lot of people don't want to come out to police or services as they're not sure if they'll be recognised or acknowledged or how that person's going to treat them when they do come out. And there's that real fear of discrimination from police or support services if there's no specific advertising advising that they're LGBTQ plus inclusive or trained, I suppose. The shame and embarrassment around reporting of abuse, fear of homophobia and transphobia from police or support services, the gendered nature of support services, so crisis accommodation, court safe rooms and perpetrator behavioural change programs. Here in Queensland, crisis accommodation, we have emergency accommodation available for only a few days for anyone that isn't a cisgender female, and after that, it's a case of having to access either homeless services or getting other financial support to get a short-term rental and that sort of thing. When we look at court safe rooms here, they can only be accessed by women, which means, you know, we've had cases of lesbian victims being in the court safe room only to then have a lesbian partner walk in there because she was allowed access because she was female, to then intimidate her and harass her to the point where the victim has left the court. Perpetrator behavioural change programs. There is one perpetrator behavioural change program for gay, bi, trans and queer identifying men, which is online based out of Victoria. Aside from that, there is unfortunately nothing that I'm aware of or that we're aware of to this day for lesbian, bi, queer and trans women. And yeah, that's pretty alarming. So, and victims have already experienced a traumatic event and they're not willing to go through another one by reporting or going through the criminal justice system. There was one victim I spoke to in New York that said to me they would rather risk staying with the perpetrator and getting stabbed than to go through the criminal justice system. So that just goes to show how, you know, terrifying that can be for some people to go through that process. Now, hopefully, if this video works, I will just play a quick video which is created by the LGBTQ Domestic Violence Awareness Foundation in 2021. And you can find this and a bunch of other helpful videos that you can use in your workplaces or in your own social media, just to look at things around the importance of bystanders and just raising general awareness around DV and LGBTQ communities.
The statistics are around 1 in 2 LGBTQ people experience an instance of violence within their relationship.
Sorry, Ben, we can't hear the video now.
Of domestic and family violence as part of their relationship or with an experience with their family of origin.
Everybody's entitled to feel safe and be safe and be able to live a life without fear of their lives being controlled and manipulated.
Men can be the victims too. Women can be violent. Women can be the perpetrators, and particularly in same-sex marriages, same-sex relationships. So I think it's very important that we change the mindset of the community and ensure that people know that it's not just within heterosexual relationships.
LGBTQ people are experiencing DV in silence, and LGBTQ folk are dying simply because we aren't doing enough to actually recognise their experiences.
I think that people who have had experiences of domestic violence within LGBTIQ relationships have not felt safe and supported to share that experience. And so that's created these barriers around them with people that they love as well as the wider community, and it's shaped the way that we look at domestic violence in all types of relationships, and we need to start to unlearn some of those lessons so that we can provide support for people.
We need legal systems that understand us. We need accommodation that if we are escaping domestic and family violence, we can go somewhere safe. They seem like just general kind of human rights needs. They don't seem very special, but asking for them seems like to be a really big ask.
Our system
is not giving them a voice. They're not being seen, they're not being heard or believed, and they don't have any pathways. This needs to change. We need to significantly invest in our vulnerable communities and ensure that they know that if they choose to seek help and support, that support is available to them.
So with the alarming figures that you've heard earlier of 62% of LGBTQ people having experienced violence or abuse, it's likely that everyone on this Zoom today has either personally been affected by violence or abuse, or they've got a friend, family member, or work colleague who has. But with 72% of victim survivors not having spoken to anyone about it, many people might not have considered the huge impact that domestic and family violence has on LGBTQ communities before today. Excuse me. So I'd like to run you through some things that you can do both personally or as an organisation to help end domestic and family violence in LGBTQ communities and ensure that there are no invisible victims in the future. So personally, there we go. You can learn more about what makes a healthy relationship. Understand what resources and support services are available for LGBTQ people experiencing violence and know how you can safely refer them. Advocate to ensure your workplace domestic and family violence policy is inclusive of all genders and sexualities, and that LGBTQ people are included in all domestic violence initiatives and conversations. And promote the LGBTQ Domestic Violence Awareness Day on your social media, personally, or through your workplace, university, or community. So as an organisation, so this is Flinders Street Station in Melbourne last year. There's also other buildings and bridges being lit up all around Australia again. Flinders Street will be like this again on Sunday, and there is a bridge in WA, which I cannot for the life of me remember the name of, which will be lit up as well, but there'll be assets lit up all around the country as a show of support for the Awareness Day and for LGBTQ victims and survivors. So workplaces, ensure your domestic and family violence policy is inclusive of all genders and sexualities. If you haven't got a policy, when you make one, make sure that this is sort of taken into consideration. Make LGBTQ domestic violence resources available to all of your employees. Include LGBTQ people in all DV initiatives and conversations. And ensure that you can identify and respond to the needs of LGBTQ staff members and clients if they are experiencing violence, and promote the DV Awareness Day on your social media and in the workplace. So workplaces, friends and family play such a huge role in preventing and responding to DV by being prepared for when it happens, not if it happens, because unfortunately it's the reality of the world we live in is someone that you know is going to be affected. And also workplaces are such an incredible, not incredible, but such an important part of our response to domestic and family violence, because often it's the only place that a victim survivor actually has safety away from the perpetrator, or can, you know, talk about it freely rather than being at home. So a few ways you can help. If you get onto the LGBTQ Domestic Violence Day Awareness Day webpage, I've been saying that way too much this week, you can take the pledge. The pledge will run you through ways you can get involved, learning more about what a healthy relationship looks like and all of the things that I've just spoken about today. There's also a toolkit on there which can give you some other ideas on how to get involved or how to raise awareness of this issue in your local community. So silence and lack of awareness play a huge part in why domestic and family violence persists. So by taking the pledge, you can do your part to help change the conversation around LGBTQ domestic and family violence. So if you want to know what to say or how to be there for a loved one, a friend, a colleague, or even a stranger who's in an unhealthy, toxic, or abusive relationship, The Be There app is a free app that gives you direct access to tools that can empower, educate, and support you to help someone who's experiencing domestic or family violence. It's available on the App Store and Google Play, and it's run through Griffith. It was created by Griffith University and Telstra Health, and it's just such an incredible resource that anyone can access. Feel free to get in touch if you have any questions, or if you'd like me to get in touch, get you in touch with some appropriate support services, and I'm more than happy to help. And if you go to the DV Foundation webpage, there's also a lot more information there on support services and information about LGBTQ domestic and family violence. But that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was great. And thank you for sharing your story. That was really powerful. There are no questions yet. So if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the either chat box or Q&A box, and we'll do questions now. I just wanted to kind of, like, that presentation highlighted how the housing and rental crisis might, add to the DV situation in Australia now, and it might get worse in LGBTQ communities. Do you see that as Ben, do you see that as a thing that might increase numbers after the recession and the housing crisis kind of becomes worse at the moment?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence, like a lot of our youth homelessness, unfortunately, is as a result of LGBTQ kids being kicked out of home because of family violence perpetrated against them because of their sexuality or gender identity. So unfortunately, obviously the housing crisis at the moment, it's definitely going to have an impact on LGBTQ people accessing housing, as well as, escaping violence as well. As adults, I should say.
Yeah. There's one just come in, a question for you, Ben. Wondering if you can speak on those living regionally and the additional barriers that we might need to consider for regional, people that live regionally.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've lived regionally myself here in Queensland, in towns ranging from 500 people to sort of 9,000-10,000 people. So I've spent a lot of my life and also policing career in those sort of areas. So I guess one of the big ones is firstly, access to support services that are going to be LGBTQ aware. Obviously, in capital cities and things like that, there's obviously a bit more availability of training and resources and organisations actually getting training around LGBTQ communities. Regionally, it can make it a bit more difficult. There's also a huge one regionally, people accessing services there, and that fear of their, not only their sexuality, gender identity, but also if they are out, just their relationship being disclosed to other people. Regional areas, well aware, everyone knows everyone. You can't go to the grocery shop without seeing someone that you know, or you can't go into a support service or into a shop without somebody knowing someone that you know. So there's that real fear that if they disclose, whether it be to police, support services, the court, that their identical sexual or gender identity or their abusive relationship is then going to be disclosed to others via that. So that's another big barrier there with disclosures. Accessibility of emergency accommodation is a huge one. I worked in a remote community up in northern Queensland, Kowanyama, which is a First Nations community up there. And, in Brisbane, we're so lucky, or in a capital city, we're so lucky. If someone needs to get into emergency accommodation, they can go into hotel accommodation overnight where the offender isn't going to know where they are. In places like that, it's a real sort of community wraparound where they go to a shelter. They're supported by local community, but it could be sort of 2, 3, 4 days before there's a plane coming into that community again that can then get them out to where a place of safety for them, to a refuge. So I'm sure it's probably very similar there in WA, where it can often be a delay. And again, that's really can be impacted by weather and things too. That was during dry season, so wet season can be even more difficult. So yeah, it's the responses are so different depending on not only your identity, but also where you are in the country.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I also just kind of highlights why organizations and health services should be kind of aware of the issue and, you know, train up to be as inclusive as possible so that people feel comfortable accessing support services, even if they are regional, because that might help with the barrier to access support services. So yeah, and the slides and the recordings will be shared. So yes, yeah, there's no more questions. So I'll wrap up now. I'm just gonna put my slides up quickly. Sorry, give me 2 secs. Oh, I think I have to. Go through your slides, sorry, just quick. So with Injury Matters, our upcoming trainings and anyone that is interested, we have a falls prevention workshop focused on diet and sarcopenia. We also have a family and domestic violence training in Katanning coming up next week on the 25th of May. And we have a load of other trainings as well. Hop onto our website and we have all the registration links for that there. And lastly, if you work in the injury prevention space, we have the Injury Prevention Network, which is a network that meets quarterly to provide professionals working in the injury prevention space an opportunity to connect with each other and share learnings and solutions. So if you want to be in part of that, just flick me an email and I'll add you to the list. Our next network meeting will be in August of this year. And also we have Connected, which is an online networking program for professionals working in the injury prevention space. And it helps you connect with other health professionals and grow your networking reach as well. And after today, an evaluation survey will pop up after this webinar concludes, and we would really like to hear your feedback about what you thought about today's webinar and if there's any other trainings you want to see from us. So we'd really value if you can fill that out. It's a quick survey. And thank you so much. Thank you, Ben, for your time to share your story and an incredible webinar. I feel like we all took so much away from that. And I feel like I've learned so much as well. So thank you. And thank you all for joining as well, the webinar. Have a good day.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ben.